Imagine you have just stepped off the train in Füssen. It is early, the air is cold and damp, and a light mist clings to the mountains. You walk uphill, follow other tourists without thinking too much, and suddenly, between the trees, the silhouette appears. White towers, dark roofs, a castle literally hanging over the void. Someone in front of you stops and says what everyone is thinking. Look, the Disney castle. You raise your phone, frame the shot, take the perfect picture. One more postcard for your travel archive, one more fairy tale castle in a Europe that seems made for Instagram. But this castle was not born to be photographed. It was born as an escape. Neuschwanstein is not just a pretty work dropped in the middle of Bavaria. It is the result of the mind of a man who did not fit into his century, of a chain of obsessive decisions, of debts that frightened an entire kingdom, and of a death that even today many consider an enigma. Behind those pale walls there was darkness, fear, conspiracies, and a silence that, more than 100 years later, still echoes in the stone. What today looks like a film set was, in its time, a scream. The desperate attempt of a king to escape his own reality. That king had a name and surname, Ludwig II of Bavaria. In tourist brochures, he usually appears as the fairy tale king, the romantic monarch, the friend of artists, the man who loved music more than politics. At first glance, it is easy to fall in love with his image. Young, melancholic, a lover of alpine landscapes and medieval legends. But if we look closely, we see something different. We see someone born to rule in an age of iron and steel, who only found comfort in imaginary worlds of knights and swans. A king crowned to manage budgets, wars, and alliances, who only wanted to build impossible castles. While you take that first picture, another character comes into play. You do not see him in your frame, but he is there almost every day. His name might be Marcus, Anna, or any other Bavarian name. He has been a tour guide for years, or perhaps a restorer of the interior paintings. He knows the secret corridors, the doors groups never cross, the official stories, and the ones that are whispered in low voices when the tourists have already gone back down to the bus. Every morning he repeats the same speech. Neuschwanstein was built by King Ludwig II of Bavaria, inspired by the operas of Wagner. He smiles, points, waits for people to take their photos. But if you gave him time, if you could walk with him when the castle is empty, he would tell you another version, less shiny, more uncomfortable, more real. Because the question that opens this documentary is simple, but uncomfortable. How can something so perfect have been born from a life so broken? Throughout this journey, we are going to follow that question like a thread. Behind every golden hall, there is a political decision. Behind every room inspired by legends of knights, there is a gesture of escapism. Behind every bill for marble, carved wood, and frescoes, there are debts that grew while the world was changing around the king. We are not facing a medieval castle, but a fantasy built with a checkbook in the middle of the 19th century, at a time when Germany was unifying. Industries were expanding, and monarchies had to prove they knew how to govern, not just how to dream. In the next few hours, we are going to enter several layers of this story. We will talk about artistic obsession and escapism, about how Ludwig built not only Neuschwanstein, but a small parallel universe in stone and light, so as not to look directly at the political reality in front of him. We will see the economic ruin and political conflicts that his dream generated, worried ministers, reports, suspicions, discreet maneuvers to push him away from power. We will pause at his death in murky circumstances, in a quiet lake that became the setting for one of the most enigmatic episodes in Bavarian history. We will also discover a side that almost never appears on postcards: the use of the castle by the Nazi regime as a storehouse for confiscated works of art, Neuschwanstein's role as a silent chest of stolen heritage from all over Europe. And we will follow the transformation of the castle into what it is today: a global tourist icon, a kind of universal symbol of the fairy tale castle that inspires theme parks, films, and millions of memories, at the cost of simplifying, if not erasing, part of its past. Our contemporary guide will be a thread connecting those two worlds. At times, we will see him explain the short and friendly version of the story to a group that will only be here for 40 minutes. In others, when the castle empties, he will take us through less traveled corridors, Let us listen to the echo of officials arguing over expenses, of laborers working at night, of doctors and ministers who signed decisive documents in closed rooms. He is, in a way, the heir to a tradition, that of telling Neuschwanstein as a dream or as a warning. And there is an important detail worth remembering from the very beginning. The castle you see today almost never came to exist. During much of its construction, Neuschwanstein was an unfinished project, a stone skeleton that seemed to devour money without end. There were moments when, on the very rock on which it stands, a very real possibility floated in the air: to stop the works, to abandon the dream, to let the mountain keep only scaffolding and half-finished walls. Some of the most controversial decisions in the recent history of Bavaria were taken precisely under the shadow of these towers. So the next time you see a perfect image of Neuschwanstein, perhaps on a screen or on a souvenir mug, you can remember this. It is not just a castle. It is an escape frozen in stone. It is the trace of a mind that could not bear its reality. It is proof of how far power can go when it decides to take refuge in fantasy, and of the consequences that has for everyone around it. In this documentary, we are going to step into the rooms that Ludwig ordered, painted with knights and swans, but also into the offices where others decided that his kingdom could no longer afford his dreams. We are going to follow the trail of the works of art that rested here during the war, and listen to the present-day voices of those who still work within these walls to preserve a dream that was never completely finished. Because to understand Neuschwanstein, it is not enough to look at it from the viewpoint and say, "How beautiful." You have to ask another question. What was happening in the head and in the country of the man who commissioned it? And to answer it, we have to take a step back in time. To understand why someone would build something like this, so expensive and so unreal, we first have to understand the man who dreamed it and the world that came to see him as a problem. Ludwig II was born in the year 1845 into a world that was already starting to become too small for dreamer kings. His childhood was marked by a strict education, carefully designed to shape a modern monarch: languages, history, law, protocol, religion. But for Ludwig, none of that was truly important. What really moved him were not the manuals on government, but the illustrated books with medieval castles, Arthurian legends, stories of knights who swore eternal loyalty to the sound of heroic trumpets. While his tutors tried to instill in him the responsibilities of royalty, he lost himself in imaginary worlds of tall towers and shadowy forests. His father, Maximilian II, was a cultured but cold monarch, more concerned with the stability of the kingdom than with his son's fantasies. His mother, Maria of Prussia, was no emotional refuge either. Her relationship with her children was always distant. Thus, Ludwig grew up surrounded by luxury, but not by warmth. His early life passed among imposing palaces, but without a truly intimate space where he could be himself. And perhaps for that reason, from childhood, he developed a habit he would maintain all his life: slipping away, whenever he could, to the surrounding alpine landscapes. There, among mountains and lakes, he felt freer than in any palace hall. In the year 1864, at only 18 years old, Ludwig became King of Bavaria after the sudden death of his father. The image of the young Ludwig entering public life is almost a romantic painting: tall, slender, pale, with deeply melancholic eyes. At first glance, a prince straight out of a pre-Raphaelite canvas. But that young man, who looked like a fairy tale figure, had to govern in one of the toughest and most pragmatic periods in European history. While he dreamed of knights and operas, Otto von Bismarck was designing German unification on the basis of relentless diplomacy, military pressure, and alliances cold as steel. The world was moving toward industry, toward railways, toward modern war. There was not much room left for dreamer kings. Here, the contrast that will mark the rest of his life begins to take shape. Ludwig wanted to be a king of the past, but he was born in a country that was moving toward the future without hesitation. He wanted to embody the idealized monarchy of the poems, where the sovereign was a spiritual guide, patron of the arts, an almost mythical figure. Reality, however, demanded political management, military decisions, budget restraint, and negotiations with powers much stronger than his small kingdom. Ludwig wore a crown, yes, but he also bore a weight he had never wanted: The more he collided with real politics, the more he took refuge in art. And here, a fundamental figure appears in this story: Richard Wagner. Ludwig discovered his music as a teenager and was literally marked by it. When he finally came to the throne, one of his first impulsive decisions was to bring the composer to Munich and protect him like a personal prophet. For Ludwig, Wagner was not just a musician, he was an architect of worlds. With his operas, he articulated exactly what Ludwig felt and did not know how to express. The majesty of Lohengrin, the mysticism of Parsifal, the volcanic emotions of the Ring of the Nibelung, all of that resonated inside the young king as if it were a sacred truth. And Ludwig, who found almost no refuge in his human surroundings, saw in Wagner a beacon, a guide, an artistic mirror of his own soul. As the years of his reign went by, Ludwig began to show clear signs of isolation. He avoided audiences, delayed meetings, delegated important decisions to ministers he barely saw. He spent hours, and sometimes whole nights, reading, walking alone, or contemplating landscapes from high balconies. The court began to whisper. They said the king lived more in the 13th century than in the 19th. That modern politics suffocated him, that he was not made to rule, but to dream. Every time the pressure became unbearable, Ludwig did what he had always done. He fled into the alpine nature. He liked to ride on horseback near the lakes, walk along rugged paths, stop before views that looked as if they had come out of a Wagnerian opera. There, he found the only form of rest that felt true. But that emotional refuge also had a side effect. The more he escaped into the outdoors, the more his need grew to build an inner refuge, a physical place where his idealized world could exist without being judged or interrupted. And so, slowly, the first spark of what would become Neuschwanstein arose, not as a national symbol, nor as a tourist project, nor even as a functional castle. It arose as an intimate idea, an almost desperate attempt to build a world that did not exist, a permanent set that could contain his fantasies, a space where Ludwig would not be a failed 19th century king, but a legendary knight of an imagined past. At some point, there is no exact date, only letters and diaries that hint at it, the fantasies stopped being just fantasies. Ludwig began to talk with architects, draftsmen, set designers. He began to gather images, plans, artistic references. He wrote about a new castle that would combine idealized medieval architecture with modern technology, a place in which to live in solitude, surrounded by music and murals. A disproportionate project for a king who already took refuge more in dreams than in politics. And then he decided to take the definitive step. If the world did not resemble his dreams, he would build a new world. What would come afterwards would be an architectural, economic, and political challenge. A castle raised on solid rock in a remote valley, a project that many would see as a whim, others as madness, and a few as the final search for meaning by a king who never found his place in reality. That world began to take shape on a rock, in a Bavarian valley, with a project that many would see as sheer madness. When Ludwig II decided he would build a new castle, he did not choose the spot at random. He chose a rock he had known since childhood, an abrupt promontory in the Bavarian Alps where the ruins of two medieval fortresses stood, Vorderhohenschwangau and Hinterhohenschwangau. Those crumbling stones had fed his imagination since he was a child, when he spent time in the nearby castle of Hohenschwangau, his family's summer residence. There, he had learned to see the landscape as a dramatic stage, mountains that looked like opera sets, forests that seemed to keep secrets, valleys where one could imagine knights in procession. That setting, more than any political treatise, was Ludwig's true emotional home. When he ascended the throne and the pressure of Munich became unbearable, he looked back at that valley with different eyes. It was no longer just a beautiful place, it was a possible refuge, and he decided that what he wanted to build there was not a defensive fortress or a representative castle to impress ambassadors. Ludwig did not want cannons or functional walls. He wanted the architecture of his dreams, a castle that looked medieval, but was not. A neo-Gothic fantasy that combined ideal towers with the technological comforts of a 19th century king. Here an essential figure comes on stage, Christian Jank, a theatrical artist. And this is key because Jank was not an architect. He was a set designer. His job was not to think about structures, stone loads, or resistance to wind. His job was to design imaginary worlds to be staged in the theater. Ludwig chose him precisely for that reason. He wanted a castle that was a work of art, a habitable set. Jank drew the first visions of Neuschwanstein as if they were stage designs for a Wagnerian opera. Drama, verticality, exaggerated perspectives. What at first sight looks like an ancient castle is, in reality, a deliberate aesthetic composition, a collage of idealized references. Architects such as Eduard Riedel, or later Georg von Dolman, received those impossible drawings with a mix of fascination and concern. Jank had designed something beautiful, but pure theater. The architects had to turn it into something that would not come tumbling down the mountain. Neuschwanstein is not a restoration of medieval ruins. It is not a reconstruction. It is an invention, a castle born of the German Romantic imagination. Clean battlements, perfect towers, white walls that never existed like that in the Middle Ages. It is inspired by the castle sets of Lohengrin, by the scenery of Tannhäuser, by illuminated manuscripts and fantastic engravings. A little from here, a little from there, but without a truly historical base. And from the beginning, the first storm warning appeared. The plans grew, and grew, and grew again. The initial idea, a modest retreat, a kind of poetic hermitage for the king, turned into a labyrinth of towers, courtyards, halls of colossal proportions, themed rooms inspired by Germanic myths. Ludwig constantly demanded changes, more height here, more gold there, a more complex mural, a vaulted ceiling with painted stars, a new balcony to contemplate the landscape. Each detail added time and money. Each room required specialized craftsmen. Each tower demanded ever more daring structural calculations. For Ludwig, all of this was absolutely necessary. Because Neuschwanstein was not the project of a king for his nation. It was not political propaganda. It was not a public work. It was his psychological refuge. And that changes everything. When Ludwig reviewed the plans, he did not talk about strategy, tourism, or diplomacy. He talked about my retreat, my peace, my inner kingdom. His letters reflect an intimacy rarely seen in a state architectural project. For him, this castle was a way of protecting himself from the outer world, an architecture that had to support an inner fantasy, a monumental shell to contain his vulnerability. But what for Ludwig was poetry carved in stone. For his ministers began to look like a financial black hole. Every tower had a bill, every mural, an unexpected cost, every delay generated alarming reports. The ministers saw numbers where Ludwig saw beauty. They saw risks where he saw salvation. They saw debts where he saw inspiration. And they began to ask themselves to what extent they could keep financing what did not seem like a project of the state, but a private dream of the king, paid with public money. The tension was planted. The castle advanced, yes, but the economic conflict began to grow like a shadow. The magnificence of the plans had a price, and someone was going to have to pay, economically and politically, that price. Because every tower, every room, every fragment of gilding had to be financed, and someone had to sign the accounts. When you look at Neuschwanstein from below, with its white walls and dark roofs, it is easy to think only of beauty. But behind every stone, there was a bill, a contract, a receipt that someone had to sign. And those papers began to pile up like a second wall, made not of stone, but of debt. To raise the castle, Ludwig II spared nothing. The rock turned into a gigantic permanent luxury workshop. Quarries working without rest to extract high-quality stone. Improvised roads to haul difficult materials up the mountain paths. Noble woods brought from far away for roofs and paneling. Kilometers of scaffolding holding a construction that grew almost like a cathedral. Inside, the expense was even more refined. The rooms were not decorated properly. They were decorated on a grand scale. Walls covered with frescoes inspired by Germanic legends. Ceilings painted like night skies. Heavy embroidered imported fabrics. Furniture designed expressly for each room without resorting to standard models. And every time the architect thought he had a definitive version, Ludwig ordered a change. A tower a little higher so that the profile would be more dramatic. An additional gallery to make better use of the view over the valley. A larger hall to do justice to a Wagnerian scene. That perfectionism was not a one-off whim, it was a habit, and every modification meant more money and more delays. Besides, Neuschwanstein was not the only dream built on debts. In parallel, Ludwig was driving other fantasy projects. Linderhof, a smaller palace but saturated with gold, mirrors, references to Louis XIV and technical whims. Herrenchiemsee, a sort of Bavarian Versailles raised on an island, with a scale so disproportionate that it seemed a declaration of love and of challenge to the French monarchy of the past. 3 gigantic projects at the same time for a single king, in a kingdom that no longer commanded as much as before. Because while Ludwig was designing rooms inspired by medieval myths, politics was heading in another direction. Bavaria formed part of the new German Empire, dominated by Prussia and by the figure of Bismarck. The Bavarian monarchy still existed, yes, but its room for maneuver was ever more reduced. In that context, a king who spent fortunes on private castles became a cause for concern. In the offices of Munich, the ministers faced an uncomfortable problem. The king's debts were private in theory, but their consequences might not be. Loans were taken out from banks, big financial houses, even wealthy individuals. Some were delighted to have the king as a debtor, others were beginning to get nervous. If Ludwig could not repay the money, who would ultimately be responsible? The state, that is, the subjects. Economic reports became ever more alarmist. They described figures that grew year after year, payment commitments hard to fulfill, promises of new works that did not fit the budgetary reality. More than one advisor wrote in an almost desperate tone that the pace of spending was unsustainable, and the more insistently they asked him to cut back, the more Ludwig locked himself into his projects. While the government demanded his presence in Munich, he took refuge in Linderhof or in Neuschwanstein itself, fleeing audiences, postponing decisions, refusing the obligations of a constitutional monarch. As a political king, less and less remained. As a king of fantasy, more and more. That vicious circle tightened. The ministers needed Ludwig to sign important documents. Ludwig avoided Munich. The economic situation worsened. He was asked for concessions, renunciations, control. Ludwig felt misunderstood, attacked. He responded by commissioning more works, more decorations, more refugees in which to hide. Prussia watched all this with a mix of irritation and cold calculation. In a German empire whose priority was stability, discipline, and an image of strength, a Bavarian king wrapped in debts and fairy tale castles could be a problem. Not a military one, but a political one. A factor of instability in a system that wanted to look impeccably ordered. In Bavaria, public perception also began to crack. The people did not see the financial balances, but they did hear rumors. The king who almost never appeared in the capital, the king of castles, the king who preferred theater and mountains to his ministers. For some, that made him endearing. For others, irresponsible. And in that climate of gossip and economic fear, a dangerous word began to be repeated. Mad. At first in low voices in small circles. His Majesty is strange. His behavior is erratic. He lives at night, sleeps by day, refuses to fulfill his duties. Then that suspicion became more explicit. Private reports described him as incapable of governing, too isolated, obsessed with artistic projects, with no real contact with politics or with the daily life of his subjects. His judgment was questioned, his emotional stability, his ability to grasp the gravity of the situation. And here a major gap opens. To what extent did those accusations reflect a true mental illness? And to what extent were they a convenient tool to remove an uncomfortable, costly, and politically problematic king? Ludwig, for his part, reacted like someone cornered. The more his spending was criticized, the more he clung to his castles. The more explanations were demanded of him, the more he withdrew into himself. The refuge he had raised on the Alpine rock was beginning to turn into a symbol of his disconnection from the world around him. In the corridors of Bavarian power, an idea that had been, at first, merely theoretical, began to be considered seriously. If the king cannot, or will not, govern according to the rules of a modern constitutional monarchy, a way must be found to do without him. And in monarchies, when a king begins to be seen as a threat to stability, the next step is almost never innocent. Reports are sought. Doctors are summoned. Diagnoses are drawn up. Legal mechanisms are prepared to declare him incapable. And when a king begins to be seen as a threat, the next step is usually to look for a way to remove him from the throne. At the end of the 19th century, declaring a king mad was not just a medical matter, it was a political weapon, and Bavaria was about to use it. At that time, Europe was beginning to discover psychiatry as a scientific discipline. New words, new categories, new diagnoses appeared. But in practice, the power of those diagnoses depended less on science and more on who ordered them and what they were going to be used for. A medical report could lock a peasant away in a sanatorium. A medical report could bring down a monarch. Around Ludwig II, that machinery was set in motion silently. The ministers, tired of debts, absences, and eccentricities, began to look for a legal way to remove him from power without provoking an open scandal. In constitutional monarchies, you could not depose a king simply because he was inconvenient. You needed an objective justification: mental incapacity, lack of judgment, danger to the state. That is where a key figure enters the scene: the psychiatrist Bernhard von Gudden. Gudden was no nobody. He was a prestigious doctor, known for his work in psychiatric hospitals and for his theories on mental illness. Precisely for that reason, his signature was very convenient. If he said the king was incapacitated, the blow would not look political, but scientific. A commission of doctors was formed. They received testimonies, letters, anecdotes about the king's behavior, his nocturnal habits, his long absences from Munich, his outbursts of anger, his extravagant decisions, his obsession with castles and with Wagner, his supposed bouts of paranoia. Strikingly, much of that information did not come from a direct and prolonged examination, but from third parties: officials, servants, members of the court, people who might have their own interests or resentments. The diagnosis, when it arrived, was devastating. Ludwig was said to have developed a mental illness that made him incapable of ruling. The ironic thing is that this verdict was issued without any deep personal exploration of the patient. To modernize, it is hard not to see there an enormous gray area. To what extent was this a rigorous diagnosis? And to what extent a conclusion almost already decided that only needed a medical stamp? Meanwhile, in Neuschwanstein and in his other refugees, Ludwig sensed that something was moving against him. There are testimonies that he felt watched, surrounded by people he could no longer trust. He asked for certain servants to be removed, distrusted visits, locked himself even more into his favorite rooms, as if by bolting doors he could stop the decisions being taken in the offices. In this kind of story, betrayal almost never comes only from strangers. To declare a king incapacitated, you needed more than a doctor, you needed family. And in Ludwig's case, the decisive figure was his own uncle, Prince Luitpold, prepared by the ministers as future regent, someone from the Bavarian royal house who could embody continuity, while the troublesome nephew was discreetly pushed aside. Around Ludwig, people who had sworn him loyalty were signing documents that, in practice, took away his voice and his power. High officials who had benefited from his favor, advisors who had enjoyed his closeness, people who owed him their position, and who, when the time came, considered that the stability of the state was above personal loyalty. It is easy from the present to condemn them without nuance. But if we look at the scene with a bit of historical empathy, the situation is more uncomfortable. A small kingdom within an empire dominated by Prussia, a monarch who was detached from politics, indebted, unpredictable. Ministers who were convinced, or at least telling themselves they were, that not intervening could lead to disaster. Was it sincere fear or perfect excuse? There was surely some of everything: genuine concern for Bavaria's future, mixed with personal ambitions, weariness, external pressure. What is certain is that, once the diagnosis had been written and the declaration of incapacity prepared, the process moved forward with a speed that contrasts with the exasperating slowness of Neuschwanstein's construction. The decisive moment came when they decided to act physically. Signatures were not enough. They had to go and fetch the king, inform him that he was deposed in practice, and transfer him into custody. A delegation of officials and doctors, among them Gudden himself, went to the refuge where Ludwig was staying. They were not going as guests. They were going to tell him, essentially, "You are no longer fit to rule. From now on, others will decide for you." It is hard to imagine the emotional impact of that instant. A man who had razed entire castles to escape a world he did not understand received the news that this same world had decided to strip him of the only thing he supposedly had left: the crown. It was not a military defeat, not a popular revolution, not a foreign invasion. It was something more intimate and devastating. His own circle, his own doctors, his own family declaring that his mind was no longer valid. The details of that confrontation vary depending on the sources. Some describe him as cooperative, almost resigned. Others suggest resistance, arguments, shouting, slammed doors, attempts to delay the inevitable. What is certain is that in the end, they reduced him to a patient, not a king. And with that change of word, everything changed. From that moment on, Ludwig ceased to be the eccentric sovereign taking refuge in castles and became something much more fragile. A man under medical supervision, watched by order of the state. And this is where the personal drama and the political drama merge completely. If Ludwig had raised Neuschwanstein as a material escape from reality, that escape was now abruptly closed. The half-finished castle, with rooms still under construction, became a kind of interrupted stage, a splendid set in which its owner no longer had any power to decide the next act. The legal process of incapacitation was complete. Prince Luitpold would be named regent. The ministers, or so they said, breathed a sigh of relief. The Ludwig problem seemed on paper to be solved, but history rarely allows itself to be wrapped up so neatly. Instead of an orderly epilogue, what came next was a night of mystery, silence, and death on a lake. In June of 1886, the King of Bavaria is no longer officially a king. He is a watched patient. After his declaration of incapacity, Ludwig II is transferred to Burg Castle on the shore of a lake then known as Lake Würm, and which today we call Lake Starnberg. It is not a prison with visible bars, but what surrounds him is almost worse. Doctors, guards, officials, a closed circle from which it is practically impossible to escape. The days there pass in a strange mix of routine and tension. Ludwig walks through the castle grounds, eats little, speaks little. He knows he's been pushed aside. He knows his uncle is already acting as regent. He knows, above all, that he has been reduced to a diagnosis. Around him, the staff move with a mixture of fear, respect, and curiosity. No one wants to be guilty of anything, but everyone is witness to something. The 13th of June of 1886 will be Ludwig's last day. In the afternoon, the king is given permission to take a walk with Dr. Bernhard von Gudden, the psychiatrist who led the report that declared him incapacitated. The orders are clear. No one is to accompany them closely, but surveillance is to be maintained from a distance. Ludwig and Gudden leave for the park. The weather is changeable. The damp air from the lake feels heavy. They go along the paths, they talk, or perhaps they do not talk, depending on who tells the story, and at some point, they go so far that they are lost from sight. Minutes go by, then far too many minutes. As night falls, the guards begin to grow uneasy. There is no sign of the king or the doctor. A hurried search is organized among the trees, along the shore, on the paths. Finally, someone sees something in the water, a short distance from the bank, a shape. Then, two. The bodies of Ludwig II and Dr. Gudden appear in the lake, already lifeless. The king, with his clothes soaked, his face turned toward the sky, his body heavy with water. The doctor nearby, with signs of struggle, bruises, wounds to the head. They are not in the middle of the lake, but in a relatively shallow area near the shore where the water is not especially deep. It is such a powerful image that, from that moment on, it no longer belongs only to the witnesses. It becomes the stuff of legend. The official version is drafted quickly. Ludwig is said to have taken advantage of the walk to attempt suicide by drowning. Gudden would have tried to stop him. There would have been a struggle, and both would have ended up in the water. The king, desperate, out of his mind. The doctor, a collateral victim of that final madness. On paper, the explanation seems to close the case. In practice, it opens it. There are details that do not quite fit. The waters in that area are not particularly deep for an adult man who can swim, and we know Ludwig had learned to do so. The king's body shows no bullet wounds, but for decades, people will speak of possible shots that are never backed by solid evidence. Gudden's injuries can be interpreted as proof of a desperate attempt to restrain the king, or as signs of an attack. The subsequent medical and police reports do not help to calm the doubts. There are incomplete documents, imprecise descriptions, testimonies that contradict one another. Some statements seem written to fit into a story already decided. Others disappear over time, filed away, lost, or simply kept where no one can consult them. The scene at the lake, which might have been a clear ending, becomes a distorted mirror. Everyone sees in it what they want to see. What happened in those minutes between the quiet walk and the discovery in the water? Was there a desperate escape attempt, taking advantage of a lapse in surveillance? Was there a violent argument between the king and the doctor, the reproach of a man who feels betrayed face to face with the one who signed his madness? Were there, as some have suggested, third parties involved who never appeared in the official reports? We cannot state it. The honest thing is to say it clearly. We do not know. What we do know is that, from the very first moment, the death of Ludwig II is surrounded by suspicion. For some, it is the logical outcome of a mind broken by pressure and isolation. For others, it is an accident far too convenient for those who needed the Ludwig problem never to resurface. Emotionally, the image is almost unbearable. The man who dreamed of halls of light, murals of knights, golden skies painted on vaulted ceilings, ends his days in the darkness of a lake, wrapped in cold water under an end-of-spring sky. The king who tried to escape the world by building castles finds himself, at last, in a place where none of his projects can keep chasing him. The reaction in Bavaria is immediate and contradictory. Part of the political elite breathes a sigh of relief. The succession crisis is resolved. Regent Luitpold can settle into his role. The Mad King is no longer a dangerous unknown. But for many people, especially among the common folk, the news is a sharp blow. Ludwig, with all his excesses, had created jobs in the regions where he built. He had left a visible mark. And, above all, he had become something more than a sovereign, an almost mythical figure, the king who preferred the night in the mountains to smoky halls full of speeches. Very soon the stories begin. The Swan King is spoken of as an operatic character who has died in his own third act. Some see him as a romantic martyr, a victim of a society too pragmatic to tolerate a dreamer. Others consider him ultimately responsible for his fate, a monarch unable to adapt who dragged his kingdom into an unsustainable situation. In the following years, each generation will add another layer of interpretation. There will be books that present him as a tragic invalid, others as a misunderstood visionary, others as a danger neutralized just in time. Lake Starnberg becomes a place of pilgrimage, of silence, of curiosity. The cross marking the approximate spot where his body was found, the flowers, the mementos, all feed the feeling that it was not only the life of a man that ended there, but an entire way of understanding monarchy. While Bavarians argue over whether their king was victim or culprit, whether that 13th of June was suicide, conspiracy, or accident, a very practical question begins to impose itself in offices and in the streets. What do we do now with the legacy he has left behind? Because Ludwig does not just leave behind an enigmatic death. He leaves half-finished castles, unfinished projects, extraordinarily expensive works the state can no longer ignore. Among them all, one shines and worries above the rest. That white castle in the mountains, still incomplete, which the king never came to inhabit fully, and which, without him, looks more than ever like a set without its protagonist. Neuschwanstein, which Ludwig imagined as an intimate refuge, a private stage for his fantasies, is about to change roles. In very little time, it will go from being the personal dream of a fallen monarch to becoming a public product, a gateway for the curious, the starting point of a new story. That of the castle which, by opening to others, changes its meaning forever. When Ludwig dies, Neuschwanstein is not that perfectly finished castle we see in pictures today. It is an ongoing project, with some areas completed and others still under construction, a strange hybrid between opera set and permanent building site. And yet, barely a few weeks go by before someone voices an idea that Ludwig would have considered almost a profanation: to open it to the public. The logic is cold and simple. The king has amassed colossal debts. The Bavarian state, which for years tried to juggle to sustain his architectural whims, now has to balance its books. There is a new, spectacular castle in the middle of a mountain landscape that already attracted visitors even before the first towers were raised. The question arises on its own: what if we charge admission? The decision is taken with a speed that contrasts with the obsessive slowness with which Ludwig changed details in his plans. What he conceived as an intimate refuge, a private stage for his Wagnerian fantasies, becomes exploitable property. The expense must be recouped. It must be shown that all that serves some purpose beyond feeding legends about the Mad King. The first visits look nothing like today's organized tours. There are no guides with microphones or groups of 30 synchronized people. It is a more chaotic procession, and above all, more loaded with morbid curiosity. People come with a mix of curiosity and judgment. They want to see what the money was spent on, how that monarch lived of whom ever more exaggerated stories are being told. Crossing Marienbrücke and seeing the castle perched on the rock, many feel the same visual impact we feel today. But behind it, there is not just admiration, there's also indignation, disbelief, gossip. Let us imagine one of those first groups. Local peasants, small-town bourgeois from Munich, perhaps a wealthier visitor from farther away, come only to see up close Ludwig's madness. They climb the steep path, look up, comment on the scaffolding, on the laborers still going in and out. They are not visiting a consolidated historic monument. They are walking through the set of a life that has just ended, almost as if they were entering the house of someone who has just died and looking, without permission, inside his drawers. It is at this point that our modern figure, that guide or restorer we introduced at the beginning of the documentary, takes on a new dimension. Today, standing before a group of tourists in colorful raincoats, he repeats the official story. This castle was commissioned by Ludwig II of Bavaria, inspired by the operas of Richard Wagner. He smiles, points out the valley, mentions the annual number of visitors, explains how long it takes to walk up, throws in a couple of light jokes to break the ice. But when the camera moves in close to his face-off duty, at the end of the day, perhaps in a cafe in Füssen, we discover that he knows a different story. He knows the castle was open to the public only a few weeks after the king's death, as if there were a rush to turn tragedy into spectacle. He knows that, at first, many visitors did not see Ludwig as a romantic visionary, but as an example of what not to do with state money. Between the polished narrative for tourists and the full story, there is a gap, and it is precisely in that gap that this documentary settles. As the decades pass, Neuschwanstein begins to change in meaning. At first, it is a strange mix of psychological mausoleum and elitist sideshow attraction, a place people go to see excess. Then, slowly, the moral judgment softens. The 19th century romantic taste blends with the new 20th century travel culture, and the castle begins to be perceived less as a symbol of waste and more as a total work of art from an era that already feels far away. The rooms Ludwig designed as nocturnal refuges, bedrooms, impossible audience chambers, the throne hall that never had a throne, start to be crossed by worn shoe soles, dripping umbrellas, quick glances. The concentrated silence with which Ludwig imagined these spaces is replaced by the murmur of visitors, the jingle of keys, the monotone voice of guides repeating the same phrases 20 times a day. Something, however, remains. Whoever enters the Singers' Hall, with its gigantic murals, its references to Germanic legends, its galleries, still feels that this place was not designed for everyday life. It is a stage, and like every stage, it accepts new roles. Our restorer guide, while supervising maintenance work on one of the towers, sums it up this way. Every generation has used Neuschwanstein to tell a different story. For Ludwig, it was an intimate, almost secret story. For his contemporaries, an expensive scandal. For 20th century tourists, a romantic place. For some now, it is simply the Disney castle. He does not say it with contempt, but with a certain melancholy. Because there is something deeply ironic in this building's fate. The man who fled the world by creating an impossible refuge has ended up, unintentionally, leaving behind one of the most photographed sets on the planet. As visitor numbers grow year after year, the inside of the castle changes little in appearance, but greatly in function. Where Ludwig imagined lonely nights, there are now opening hours. Where he planned private rituals, there are now time slots, groups, languages. In the corridors, besides the echo of footsteps, another kind of logistics begins to resound. Insurance, conservation, cleaning, constant maintenance of a building that was never designed to withstand millions of footsteps. And yet, no matter how tempting it may be to think Neuschwanstein has been reduced to a tourist backdrop, the 20th century still has an unexpected role reserved for it. For a time, the Bavarian kingdom's financial difficulties are eased by that steady flow of visitors. The castle becomes a source of income, almost a business. But the real twist is yet to come, and it has nothing romantic about it. Because a few decades after Ludwig's death, under a very different Germany in power, Neuschwanstein will stop being, for a while, a place that displays and become a place that hides. The same architectural fantasy that served as a mental refuge for a maladapted king will be transformed into something much colder. A carefully chosen hiding place for one of the most sinister regimes in European history, which we'll see in these high walls, in these discreet corridors, and in this remote location, the perfect combination to keep safe what it does not want to lose if the world collapses around it. In the late 1930s, the Third Reich develops a systematic obsession with art. It is not just aesthetic taste, it is an ideological project and war booty. Museums, private collections, galleries throughout occupied Europe are emptied with a mix of cold bureaucracy and naked violence. Some paintings are legally confiscated through anti-Semitic laws that strip Jewish families of their property. Others are torn straight from the walls in front of owners who know that protesting may cost them their freedom or their lives. Each object is inventoried, catalogued, labeled. Theft becomes administration. That torrent of paintings, sculptures, tapestries, and archives needs safe places. It is not enough to store them in Berlin or Munich, obvious targets for Allied bombs. The regime looks for remote, solid, discrete sites, old monasteries, salt mines, castles in mountainous areas. On that map of secret depots, Neuschwanstein appears as a perfect square. A modern fortress disguised as the Middle Ages, perched on a rock in the Allgäu, far from major industrial centers, with large, easily controlled rooms. A stone guardian with only one complicated road leading up to it. Suddenly, the same rooms Ludwig imagined full of Wagnerian murals, legendary scenes, and knights begin to receive another kind of cargo. No musicians arrive, nor guests for romantic dinners that never took place. Crates arrive. Numbered wooden crates, sealed with labels in German, French, Dutch, Italian. Crates too heavy to be just documents. Crates making their way up the steep road on trucks or carts, unloaded by soldiers and laborers who do not always know what they are transporting, but understand that it is important because everything is done with tense haste and clear orders. Do not look, do not ask. Let us imagine a day in 1943 inside the castle. In the great hall without a throne, the echo of footsteps no longer belongs to a sleepless king, but to officers checking lists. On one side, wrapped paintings leaning against walls already decorated with scenes from Lohengrin. On another, temporary shelving where sculptures protected with coarse cloths are stacked. A painting that hung for decades in the living room of a Jewish family in Paris now rests under the painted ceiling of a Bavarian castle whose name its former owners may never have heard. A few meters away, a religious carving from a Polish church shares space with archives confiscated from a university in Eastern Europe. Neuschwanstein becomes a kind of inverted museum, a place where art is not displayed but hidden, where beauty exists but not to be contemplated, rather to be preserved as loot or as an investment for a future the regime believes it controls. Ludwig's romantic fantasy, that mixture of Germanic legends raised to the scale of architecture, is literally covered by other fantasies, those of a power that intends to reorder Europe and its culture as if it were reorganizing a private warehouse. There is a bitter irony in all this. Ludwig spent fortunes populating his walls with opera heroes, scenes of redemption and chivalric honor, an idealized Middle Ages where art was refuge and solace. The Third Reich uses those same walls to protect objects taken from specific people, with names and surnames erased in forms, while those people are deported, persecuted, or forced to flee. The castle, once criticized for excess, becomes a silent accomplice of a massive crime. Not because it has any will, but because its solidity and isolation make it useful to those who do. Our contemporary guide, in a pause between groups, stops in front of one of the rooms and lowers his voice, as if the building itself could hear him. In this room, where today hundreds of tourists pass every hour, there was a time when almost no one came in. Only a few men with lists in their hands. What they were guarding here was not a treasure of Bavaria, but the disordered remains of dismantled lives far from these mountains. He does not tell this in the standard tour. It is a part of the story that requires more context than fits into a 40-minute visit. One of the most unsettling paradoxes of Neuschwanstein under the Third Reich is the meticulousness with which those stolen treasures are managed. The Nazis generate detailed inventories, note down provenances, describe pieces with the precision of museum curators. That same bureaucratic obsession that serves to organize the plunder will, decades later, be a key tool for restitution. Thanks to some of those lists, it will be possible to prove that a given painting found in a certain depot actually belonged to a particular family. It is as if the castle, without wanting to, were storing not only objects, but the traces needed so that, in future, someone can piece together at least part of the truth. Meanwhile, outside those walls, the war is approaching its climax. The bombings intensify, cities burn, fronts shift. In Bavaria, the sense of safety cracks. It is no longer unthinkable that the Neuschwanstein Valley might one day see enemy planes overhead. And with that possibility comes another fear. That, faced with impending defeat, the regime will carry out its own scorched earth orders and destroy the art depots so that they do not fall into Allied hands. That what began as a fantasy castle will end in ruins along with the works it shelters. In the last months of the war, the silence inside the castle becomes almost physical. The crates are still there, piled up, while news from the front arrives distorted and contradictory. Some of the men guarding the depot begin to wonder whether, when the time comes, they will obey orders to blow up the cargo or look the other way. Outside, the mountain landscape seems indifferent. Inside, every plank of wood encapsulating a painting, every seal on a chest of documents weighs more than ever. When the Third Reich begins to collapse, Neuschwanstein is ready for yet another change of role. It has been a dreamed refuge, a budget scandal, a morbid attraction, a chest of plunder. The next chapter will see it once again crossed by men who come from outside. This time, not to hide, but to search. Not to confiscate, but to discover what has been hidden here and to whom it really belonged. When Allied troops advanced into southern Germany in 1945, they did not know exactly what they would find at Neuschwanstein. They knew from earlier reports that the Nazis had created secret art depots in mines, monasteries, and castles, but the real scale of the looting was still a mystery. Upon entering the castle, they discovered rooms full of carefully labeled crates, meticulous inventory lists, and works of enormous cultural value stored as if they were goods in transit. Flemish paintings, Italian sculptures, archives confiscated from Jewish private collections, objects from French, Belgian, Dutch museums. Each crate was a story torn from its owners, each list evidence of the plunder. The Monuments Men, that group of art experts recruited by the Allies, spent weeks examining, cataloging, and preparing the material for restitution. Neuschwanstein was not just a depot, it was a node in a network of systematic theft. From its inventories, thousands of pieces could be returned, or at least their legitimate owners could be identified. Others, sadly, never found their way back, but the castle became one of the key points for reconstructing the route of Nazi looting. In the months and years that followed, the castle was emptied of crates, but not of meanings. Bavaria, and Germany in general, had to rewrite its public image. The post-war period demanded material reconstruction and symbolic reconstruction as well. What to do with a castle that had been the refuge of an eccentric king, an early attraction, the strongbox of the Reich, and a silent witness to thousands of violently uprooted stories? The answer was subtle and effective: to clean it up narratively. Not to hide it exactly, but to shift the focus. Neuschwanstein was promoted as a symbol of romantic Bavaria, the Bavaria of mountains, cows, green meadows, lederhosen, traditional music. Ludwig's story was rewritten in a softer tone, not a problematic, indebted king, but a fairy tale king, a tragic dreamer who built a castle to escape a cruel world. And that image fit perfectly with the cultural climate of the 1950s and 60s. Europe wanted to forget the war, at least in part. American tourists, who were beginning to travel en masse to the continent thanks to commercial flights and the rise of car travel, sought idyllic landscapes, enchanted castles, places that looked like postcards, not trauma sites. Neuschwanstein ticked all the boxes. Easy to photograph, surrounded by spectacular mountains, with a silhouette that looked designed by a children's book illustrator, without the visible scars the war had left on so many cities. In the 1950s, the first tourist brochures appear. Travel agencies included as an obligatory stop on alpine routes. Buses start arriving in groups. The viewpoints fill with Kodak cameras clicking non-stop. What in Ludwig's day was a secluded spot for dreaming becomes a tourism machine. Our modern guide restorer reappears here as a counterpoint. We see him welcoming a group of retired Americans, cameras around their necks. He tells them the shortened story, Ludwig, the Dreamer King, Neuschwanstein, his fairy tale castle. They smile, nod, ask whether the castle inspired Disney or whether princesses lived here. No one mentions the Nazi depot. No one asks about the crates or the monuments men. Not out of malice, simply because the romantic story is easier to tell. Lighter, more compatible with a 35-minute visit before getting back on the bus. In his breaks, sitting on a terrace with a view of the castle, the guide sighs. Every day, he says, I watch hundreds of people come looking for a dream, and that is fine. But I always think about what lies beneath that dream. Debts, death, stolen art, broken lives, and still, the image that wins out is the pretty one. The postcard. The castle's story becomes, in itself, a metaphor for 20th century Germany. A tragic past rewrapped in shiny paper and exported as a tourist symbol. An emotional reconstruction as pragmatic as the economic one. From the 1960s onward, tourism skyrockets. Germany lives through its economic miracle. Volkswagen and Mercedes cars fill European roads. Young people start traveling earlier than ever. Schools organize trips. Neuschwanstein officially becomes one of the most visited destinations in the country. The revenues, which in Ludwig's time would have seemed like science fiction, multiply. The castle becomes a huge economic asset, a source of cultural funding, a symbol not just regional, but national. At this point, Neuschwanstein is no longer just a monument, it is a brand. Gift shops sell mugs, magnets, calendars, miniature replicas. German films of the period show it as an idyllic backdrop. Postcards reproduce it endlessly. It matters little that Ludwig never lived there for long or that the castle was unfinished at his death. What matters is the image. Perfect, white, suspended on the rock. And this is where Neuschwanstein's fate spins again. Because while visitors pose for their photos, another eye, on the other side of the world, is watching the castle with a mix of fascination and inspiration. A man who also thinks in terms of fantasy, emotional architecture, ideal worlds. A man who does not build castles for kings but for millions of visitors. This man sketches on napkins in Los Angeles. He thinks about theme parks as dream machines. And when he sees Neuschwanstein, he immediately recognizes its symbolic potential. That man's name is Walt Disney. In the middle of the 20th century, while Neuschwanstein was consolidating itself as the perfect postcard of post-war Bavaria, someone very far from there was trying to answer another question. How do you build a place where people can physically step into a fairy tale? That someone was Walt Disney. Before it was an empire, Disney was a man obsessed with stories, with miniature castles he drew for his early films, with the idea that architecture could be another character. And, like so many North American artists and entrepreneurs of his generation, he traveled to Europe in search of inspiration. On those trips, documented in diaries, photographs, and testimonies, Disney walked through cities, museums, medieval towns, and castles. We cannot accompany him physically, but we can imagine the scene. A small group, a camera around his neck, a notebook, and, suddenly, the silhouette of Neuschwanstein rising over the valley. It is not an authentic medieval castle. It does not have centuries of wear in its stones, but it is probably the castle that most closely resembles a drawing. For someone like Disney, used to turning emotions into simple shapes, Neuschwanstein is almost a revelation. Sharp towers cutting clean against the sky. Proportions designed to impress visually rather than to withstand sieges. A natural setting that looks like a stage set. It does not take much effort to trace the line connecting that visit to the design of Sleeping Beauty Castle in Disneyland. Disney's Imagineers, the attraction designers, feed on many sources: French chateaux, German fortresses, Central European palaces. But Neuschwanstein is there, clearly recognizable. In the profile of the central tower, in the way the building seems to grow upward rather than spread sideways, in that blend of historicist romanticism and pure fantasy. The result is almost a funhouse mirror. Ludwig built a castle to hide from the modern world. Disney builds a castle to attract the modern world, so that whole families can walk through a gate and feel they have left behind the reality of parking lots and highways. The first goes into debt to raise his private dream on a Bavarian rock. The second raises his public dream in Anaheim and turns that silhouette into a global logo. The transformation is brutal if we sum it up in two figures. From a melancholic, isolated king criticized by his ministers, walking alone at night through halls decorated with opera scenes, to a smiling merchandising mouse, printed on backpacks, t-shirts, soft drink cups, posing in front of an almost twin castle under fireworks. Same basic image, completely different meanings. Our modern guide restorer sees it every day. He goes in with a group of visitors from Asia, some wear Mickey ears on their heads. One of them raises a phone, frames Neuschwanstein between the trees, and says, without hesitation, "Look, the Disney castle." The guide smiles. He's used to it. He explains patiently, "Actually, it is the other way around. This castle came first. It was one of the inspirations for Disney's version." Some are surprised, others nod politely, others keep taking photos without really processing the information. For them, the logical order is the one they have known since childhood. First the films, then the real world that looks like them. That shift in reference is key. Neuschwanstein ceases to be Ludwig's castle and becomes, in the global imagination, the fairy tale castle par excellence, a mold, an abstract icon, a shape repeated in theme parks, logos, sets, video games, travel ads, wedding cakes. Ludwig's original fantasy, a personal refuge, built almost as a stage for Wagnerian operas, becomes the universal prototype of the happy castle, stripped of conflicts, debts, medical intrigues, depots of stolen art. It is as if time had smoothed away all its rough edges and left only the most easily digested silhouette. This metamorphosis also says a lot about us as a society. It is more comfortable for us to consume Neuschwanstein as part of a global fantasy circuit than as what it really is, the extreme result of a clash between romantic sensibility and pragmatic politics, between dream and ruin. Architecture, once turned into an icon, becomes independent from its history. A child in Tokyo recognizes the castle shape from Disney long before knowing what Bavaria is, who Ludwig II was, or what happened in Lake Starnberg. Our guide, at the end of the day, stands alone for a moment on one of the inner terraces. He looks at the walls decorated with scenes from Lohengrin, Tannhäuser, Parsifal. He thinks of Ludwig listening to Wagner's music while imagining these walls. He thinks of Disney traveling through Europe with his sketches. And then he remembers the tourists that very morning pointing at the castle and calling it, without hesitation, real-life Disneyland. He wonders what Ludwig would say if he saw his refuge turned into a template for theme parks. Would he be outraged? Would he consider it a posthumous triumph, a confirmation that his sensibility, so ridiculed in life, has become the visual canon of the fairy tale? We have no answer, only the hunch that he would have been fascinated by his castle's ability to colonize the planet's imagination, and perhaps horrified by how little of his real life is remembered under that layer of glitter. The relationship between Neuschwanstein and Disney is not just an architectural anecdote. It is the perfect example of how a specific place, born from a very particular and painful biography, can be recycled by mass culture until it becomes almost generic. A stage where families pose and children dream, without suspecting that the original set was built on loneliness, debts, and a death wrapped in shadows. The question is, what gets lost along the way when a concrete place with a very painful history becomes a decontextualized global icon? The answer lies in how we consume Neuschwanstein today. Millions of visits, selfies, gift shops, and a past compressed into a leaflet. In the height of summer, Neuschwanstein starts to wake up before the sun. Not for Ludwig, nor for restorers, nor for historians, for buses. Whole fleets rolling in from Munich, Zurich, Innsbruck. Families, backpackers, retirees, school groups. At 8 in the morning, the lower station is already full of voices, mixed languages, children hastily eating pastries, guides holding up numbered paddles. The castle, seen from below, looks more like a backdrop than a real building, suspended in the morning clouds. The lines begin to form even before it opens. They are not lines of reverence, but of logistics. Strict time slots, schedules printed on electronic tickets, warnings that anyone arriving late will miss their group. Neuschwanstein is no longer visited, it is processed. Each group has about 20 or 30 minutes to enter, move along, listen, admire, photograph, and leave. The castle Ludwig conceived as a personal sanctuary has become a corridor through which more than 1 million people a year pass, each one trying to capture a scrap of fantasy before the guide says, "We must continue." Inside, the pace is almost military. There is no possibility of turning back. The corridors, designed to impress, now function as pipelines for tourists. The official narrative is distilled into three pillars: the romantic king, the fairy tale castle, the tragic ending that makes it even more fascinating. Death, the politics of the time are mentioned briefly, but in a soft tone, almost decorative. The story of the Nazi depot almost never appears, not because there is a deliberate desire to hide it, but because it does not fit into a 30-minute tour whose real goal is to move people through without collapsing the building. Our guide comes into the picture again, this time during an exhausting morning. He has a perfectly memorized script, adapted to the timing and the type of group. This hall represents Ludwig's chivalric ideal. This room reflects his admiration for Wagner. Ludwig lived here only for a few months, and while he speaks these lines he repeats hundreds of times a year, he remembers the other story, that of the king ever more isolated, that of the political diagnosis disguised as medicine, that of the crates of stolen art these same walls hid during the war. Stories he knows in depth, but cannot tell without breaking the choreography of the visit. Inside, he feels the castle has two parallel lives: the official one, curated, clean, comfortable, and the real one, full of wounds, contradictions, silences. Selective memory is a powerful force. It does not lie, it edits. It trims nuance so that it fits the right frame, the perfect photo, the narrative expected of a fairy tale castle. It romanticizes what hurts, softens what is uncomfortable, forgets what would undermine the charm. In the gift shop, that selective memory is almost tangible. Dozens of magnets, t-shirts, puzzles, notebooks, figurines. Ludwig appears as a dreamy knight or a Prince Charming, not as the man who faced a political machine that declared him unfit. Neuschwanstein always appears bathed in golden light, never in the dark mist that surrounded his last months. The products are adorable, impeccable, commercially irresistible, but they share a common thread. They tell only one version of the story. Here, the great ethical question of modern tourism arises. How do you honor the complexity of a place like this while selling magnets and mugs? It is not a trivial dilemma. The castle needs income to survive. Restoration, conservation, and research are expensive. Mass tourism funds that survival. But the price of that system is that the narrative is simplified, polished, made digestible. The average visitor takes home a happy memory, not a faithful portrait. And yet, amid so much noise, so many flashes, timed visits, and packaged souvenirs, there are still corners where the castle seems to breathe as it did in Ludwig's time. Sometimes, in a break between groups, the guide stops in a little-used corridor. Cold light comes in through a narrow window. There are no voices, no photos, no rush, only the echo of a building conceived as a private sanctuary for a man who sought silence. And for a moment, only for one, it seems that silence is still there, hidden in the cracks, waiting for whoever has the patience to listen. Neuschwanstein, seen from afar, looks immortal. Always the same in photos, identical on postcards, frozen in that perfect image of white towers and dark roofs above the forest. But up close, when the cameras are turned off and the doors close to the public, another reality appears. The castle gets tired. Every year, millions of footsteps climb the stairs. Each group brings with it humidity, dust, temperature changes, breath, sweat, wet coats, doors that open and close without pause. All that leaves traces that do not show up on Instagram, but that the restorers know very well. The walls breathe. The stone absorbs. The wood creaks slightly differently in winter than in summer. The murals, designed to impress a few carefully chosen guests, now withstand the quick, distracted gaze of crowds moving like a constant current. In a high room, when the castle is already empty, someone sets up a silent scaffold in front of a mural. There are no tourists, no guides, no flashes. Only a cold lamp illuminating a fragment of painting. A knight, a dragon, a Wagnerian scene. A restorer climbs up. It may be the same person who was working as a guide in the morning, or one of those technicians who almost never appear in official photos. He wears gloves, a mask, fine brushes, gentle solutions to clean, consolidate, repair. His work has nothing spectacular about it. Hour after hour, he checks small detachments, micro cracks, areas where the pigment has lifted by barely 1/1000th of a millimeter. Each brushstroke is a silent conversation with the 19th century artists who painted this for the first time. His dilemma is constant. How far can we intervene without betraying what it was? If he restores too much, the castle becomes a recent copy, a kind of freshly painted theme park. If he restores too little, Ludwig's dream crumbles slowly, eaten away by damp use time. In an unwritten work schedule, there are priorities. Controlling humidity in the most delicate rooms. Checking the roofs, because a roof that is no longer watertight means leaks, and leaks are the real enemy. Adapting climate control systems so that the interior does not turn into an oven in summer or a freezer in winter, without filling the walls with visible pipes that break the illusion. Visitors almost never see what keeps the castle alive: the hidden machines, renewed electrical systems, discrete sensors measuring temperature, vibration, air quality. Ludwig wanted a medieval castle with modern technology for his time. Today, his spiritual successors try to keep it historic on the outside and discreetly technological on the inside. Sometimes, in the middle of a restoration, something happens that breaks the technical routine. When a molding is removed, a small mark appears on the back of a board. A name, a date, a symbol drawn by an anonymous craftsman. Inside a cavity no one had opened for more than a century, a scrap of paper is found with color notes, a sketch of how a painted sky should look, a written instruction for another member of the workshop. They are tiny remains, almost worthless to the general public, but for the restorers they work like little greetings from the past. They do not speak of kings or great decisions, but of the people who climbed similar scaffolds, got their hands dirty, sweated in front of these same walls when they still smelled of fresh plaster. Seen this way, the castle stops being just Ludwig's dream and becomes a collective organism. It was designed by a set designer. It was approved, reluctantly, by ministers. It was built by bricklayers, stonemasons, carpenters, painters. It is kept alive by technicians, historians, engineers, guides, cleaners. Every generation has added a layer, visible or invisible, to that dream. And another difficult question arises: which version of Neuschwanstein are we really preserving? The one Ludwig imagined? Because many of the original projects were never completed as he dreamed them. The one that had been built just before his death? That unfinished castle, still in transformation, which he walked through on his sleepless nights? Or the version the 20th century ended up fixing when it became a tourist symbol, with certain areas reinforced, others closed off, some spaces adapted to the flow of visitors? Every conservation decision is deep down a stance. When a lost fragment of ornament is remade, someone is deciding how it should have been. When a crack is left visible, they are stating, "This ages, this is real." When a modern installation is hidden behind a fake molding, they are choosing to keep the illusion intact, even at the cost of adding elements Ludwig never saw. In less frequented rooms, restorers sometimes choose to leave small traces of the passage of time, a slight difference in tone, an area where the original layer and the modern intervention can both be seen. They are like marginal notes in an old book, reminders that history did not end in 1886, nor in 1945, nor in 1955. Neuschwanstein is not a still photograph, but a sentence we all keep writing together. And next to the physical cracks, there are others, the symbolic ones. The inconsistencies between the story told to the public and the one kept in the archives. The areas where it is decided not to dig too deep because it would make the visit too heavy, too uncomfortable, too long for a group that just wants to see the fairy tale castle. The silences about certain episodes, certain complicities, certain decisions taken in the name of the kingdom, of tourism, or of Bavaria's image. Our restorer, the same one who perhaps also works as a guide, lives on that frontier. In the morning, he walks through halls with groups bound to schedules and scripts. In the afternoon, he climbs scaffolding and cleans, consolidates, studies paint layers that never appear in any leaflet. In his mind, Neuschwanstein is not just an icon. It is a delicate patient, a historical echo chamber, a contradiction made stone. When he switches off the light at the end of the day, the castle is left in half darkness. From outside, it is still perfect, just like on the postcards. Inside, among folded scaffolding, stored tools, and areas marked with discrete tape, you see the seams of the dream, places where fantasy and matter collide, and you have to decide what to sacrifice. A bit of authenticity so that the building does not collapse. A bit of historical truth so that the fairy tale does not turn into a lie. In those cracks, the ones running through the stone and the ones cutting through memory, is where Neuschwanstein shows its most uncomfortable side. It is not only the idealized castle we think we know, but also a mirror of how we choose to remember. Neuschwanstein, as we see it today, looks like a harmless place, a perfect backdrop for happy photos, a dream crystallized in stone. But if we look a little more closely, the castle starts to become something unsettling, almost disturbing, because it did not appear out of nowhere. It was born of a decision, that of a man in power who chose to flee and who used public resources to build his escape. Ludwig II did not raise Neuschwanstein as a collective project, nor as a defensive fortress, nor as infrastructure for his people. He raised it as an alternative world. While Bavaria and the rest of Germany were transforming at a dizzying pace, unification, wars, industrialization, their king was designing a refuge where none of that existed. Inside the castle there are no factory chimneys, no parliaments, no critical newspapers. There are knights, swans, legends, music that speaks of honor and sacrifice in an unclear time that never fully existed. In a certain sense, Ludwig did what many of us would like to do when faced with a reality that overwhelms us: close the door and escape. Only that, unlike most people, he could turn that fantasy into stone, paid for largely with money that came from a real kingdom, from real taxpayers, from an economy that was anything but a fairy tale. That makes Neuschwanstein more than just an aesthetic eccentricity. It is the portrait of a kind of power that refuses to look change in the eye, that locks itself inside its own story, that pours fortunes into building a stage where conflict disappears. It is not so different, if we think about it, from certain contemporary elites who design their own modern castles, gated communities where the surrounding city is barely perceptible, luxury complexes on private islands, self-sufficient bunkers in remote parts of the planet. The materials change, once stone and frescoes, now glass and concrete, digital surveillance, data servers. But the logic is disturbingly similar. If the world is uncomfortable, let us build a parallel world where it is not. And yet, reducing Ludwig to the caricature of the irresponsible king who spent too much would be too easy, and also unfair. We return to him as a human figure, the shy teenager who preferred music to politics, the young man fascinated by Arthurian myths, the adult who feels increasingly sidelined in a system dominated by hard, pragmatic men, experts in negotiation and war. In a Europe that rewards military efficiency and realpolitik, Ludwig embodies the opposite: aesthetic excess, raw emotion, and almost physical need for beauty and fiction. It is tempting to present him as a misunderstood romantic hero. It is also easy to turn him into a villain, a symbol of absolute irresponsibility. But the truth is probably in an uncomfortable middle ground. Ludwig was a hypersensitive man trapped in an office that demanded exactly what he could least provide: toughness, calculation, coldness. Faced with that pressure, he chose something many would understand on a small scale, to take refuge in his inner world, but carried through to its ultimate consequences, backed by almost absolute power. That is the point at which Neuschwanstein stops being just beautiful and becomes a mirror of questions. What happens when someone with unlimited power decides that their priority is not their people, but their own emotional escape? Where is the line between the sensitivity we must respect and the responsibility that cannot be abandoned? On top of all this comes a chapter that makes the legacy even murkier: the castle's use by the Third Reich. Ludwig never imagined a totalitarian regime occupying the halls he had filled with scenes of redemption, tragic love, and idealized nobility. And yet, decades later, those same spaces were used to store stolen works, the result of policies of persecution and plunder. The message is clear and harsh: no place is neutral. However beautiful it may be, any building can be redefined by the power that controls it at any given moment. Neuschwanstein was first the mental refuge of a lonely monarch, then the strongbox for a dictatorship's loot. Today, it is a tourism engine that wraps its own history into soft doses for quick consumption. That chain of uses poses an uncomfortable question for us, spectators of the 21st century. Can we enjoy a place like this as if it were only a backdrop, without asking what stories have passed through it? When we pose smiling at the viewpoint, are we aware that behind that postcard there are debts, dubious diagnoses, corpses in a lake, trains loaded with stolen art? Perhaps that is why Neuschwanstein produces such a strange feeling. It dazzles us, attracts us, makes us want to see it with our own eyes. But as soon as we learn a bit more about its origin, a hint of unease appears that is hard to shake off. We sense that this castle is not simply pretty. It is the visible result of a mix of human fragility and misdirected power, of escapism turned into policy, of decisions that affected thousands of people who would never sleep in those gilded rooms. To return to Ludwig in the end is not a sentimental gesture, but almost a necessary one. Not to absolve him, nor to condemn him without nuance, but to remind ourselves that behind every monumental symbol, there is someone who made decisions from within their own inner maze. He did not want to be the villain of his own story. He wanted to be the poet king, the patron, the builder of a place truer than reality. But the result no longer belongs to him. Neuschwanstein slipped from his hands as soon as he died. It passed to the state, then in practice to the Nazis, later to the tourism machine, now to the global imagination that confuses it with a film logo. And there another layer of responsibility appears, ours. The way we look at the castle, how easily we accept the simplified version, how quickly we turn real tragedies into friendly decoration for mugs, magnets, and t-shirts. We cannot change what Ludwig was, nor what the Nazis did, nor the economic decisions of the post-war period. But we can decide how we look at this place today, as a simple, pretty backdrop, or as an uncomfortable story that deserves to be told in full, even when it spoils the fantasy a little. Perhaps that is why, when you leave Neuschwanstein at the end of the day and watch it recede through the bus window, a double feeling remains. On the one hand, awe at its perfect silhouette. On the other, a small voice saying that nothing so perfect is built without shadows. Neuschwanstein exists in Bavaria, but it also lives in thousands of places where it has never physically been. It is on the covers of children's books, in fantasy video games, in perfume commercials, in television bumpers, in posters at foreign universities, in online travel agencies, in tattoos, in phone wallpapers. Its silhouette, those sharp towers, those white walls perched high on a mountain, has become a universal visual language, recognizable even to someone who has never heard the word Neuschwanstein. It is enough to see a drawing that combines mountains, mist, and a semi-impossible castle for the brain to say automatically, "This is a fairy tale." And behind that conditioned reflex stands Ludwig, even though almost no one remembers him. On screen, the castle has appeared in 1,000 ways, sometimes filmed directly, sometimes reinterpreted as an archetype. Historical series use it as a metaphor for decadence or as a setting for kings and princesses who never existed. In video games, especially in fantasy worlds, its architecture appears in fragments, mixed with other influences, as if Neuschwanstein were a bank of ideas from which anyone can borrow a tower here, a bridge there. Advertising uses it to sell everything from chocolate to luxury cars. One single image, and that's enough. Escapism, romance, perfection. Globalization has made something deeply local, a Bavarian castle loaded with a painful, very specific history, into a generic symbol of the marvelous. It is as if the world had decided that Neuschwanstein is too beautiful to belong only to Bavaria, too perfect to have a real history, too attractive to let reality stain it. And yet, the more universal it becomes, the further it drifts from what it really is. Most people who recognize the castle on a poster know nothing about Ludwig, or the financial ruin, or the suspicious night at the lake, or the castle's role in the Second World War, or the political disputes surrounding its construction. What they recognize is the polished version, filtered through decades of reinterpretations and symbolic reductions. Our guide restorer, that figure who has accompanied us through the castle's contemporary story, knows better than anyone the distance between symbol and reality. In the morning, as he sorts a group at the entrance, he sees tourists showing each other phone screens with castle emojis that suspiciously resemble Neuschwanstein. He hears people say, "It is the Disney castle," or "It is the castle from my favorite book." He smiles because he understands the excitement, but feels a strange pang. The place he knows from the inside, with its cracks, its damp patches, its history, its contradictions, appears reduced to a flat, luminous icon with no story. Later, when his workday ends and the castle is empty, he walks through a corridor where the echo of his footsteps bounces off plaster and stone walls dating from the 19th century. He touches a slightly cool column, feels the texture of the restored mural, notices a detail no one will ever see from the tourist route. He thinks about the contrast between the real Neuschwanstein, a living, fragile building full of wounds and layers, and the symbolic Neuschwanstein, an emoji, a sticker, a poster that compresses all that complexity into a perfect silhouette drawn in pastel blue. The inevitable question then emerges. How many times have you seen this castle without knowing who dreamed it? Without knowing who paid for it? what sacrifices it involved, what arguments it sparked, what tragedies accompanied its construction. How many times have we consumed its image without realizing it was born from a desire to flee, from a monarchy in crisis, from a political conflict that ended in a dark lake? Neuschwanstein has become so detached from its roots that in the global collective mind, it occupies a space similar to that of dragons, unicorns, or fairies, something beautiful, but supposedly without history, as if it had not been created by real hands in a real era at a real cost. And yet, when we look at it again in photos or films, something persists, a feeling almost impossible to explain, a mixture of fascination and melancholy, the sense that behind that postcard there is a story that does not quite match the shiny surface, as if our subconscious sensed that no fairy tale castle appears without a price. That is the point at which Neuschwanstein shows that its cultural influence goes beyond the visual. It has shaped what we understand by fantasy. It has given form to our idea of the magical. It has created an aesthetic standard we now associate with princesses, epic stories, and imaginary worlds. But it also reminds us, quietly, that every fantasy has an origin, and that origin is rarely as perfect as the symbol that ends up being sold to the world. The castle lives in our stories, in our logos, on our screens, but it also lives in the tensions between historical truth and idealized image, between escapism and responsibility, between what it was and what we have decided it means today. If we look back, the path we have followed in this documentary seems almost unreal. We began with an anonymous tourist riding a bus up to a castle in the mist. We met a king born out of his century who preferred scores and legends to budgets and parliaments. We saw how, from an almost theatrical sketch, an outsized architectural project was born, how that project swallowed fortunes, political patience, and complete reputations. We followed the shadow of a death in a lake, on a night full of questions that still have no clear answer today. We accompanied the castle when it became a strongbox for art stolen by the Third Reich, when it was later repackaged as a friendly symbol of the new Bavaria, and when it crossed the ocean disguised as a Disney castle. Today, we leave it as cues, phone flashes, mugs in the shop, fluorescent posters, and at the same time controlled decay, fragile walls, restores silently repairing what tourism wears down. That journey contains Neuschwanstein's true hidden legacy. Because this castle does not just tell us the story of Ludwig II, it speaks of something deeper, of how easily power, when it feels cornered, takes refuge in fantasy. Ludwig did this literally, raising stone upon stone an alternative world where night still existed, where there was honor, aesthetic devotion, and Wagnerian music echoing in throne rooms that would almost never be used. But in some way, we still do something similar. We build parallel realities, physical or digital, where everything seems simpler, more beautiful, more fairy tale than the world we leave outside. Neuschwanstein also reminds us that no place is completely innocent. A castle can begin as an intimate refuge, become a symbol of ruin for a government, later serve as a warehouse for the loot of a criminal regime, be reused as a tourist showcase, and end up as a global fantasy icon for children and adults. The building is the same. What changes again and again is the story we decide to tell about it. Europe has become an expert at this, recycling its traumas into postcards, turning conflict sites into travel products, softening the sharp edges of its past until they are smooth enough to be printed on a fridge magnet. If we imagine Ludwig watching all this for a moment, the image is strange. He, who sought silence, would see orderly rows of visitors moving to the rhythm of timed slots. He, who shut himself in carriages at dawn to go up the mountain alone, would find shuttle buses, crowded car parks, multilingual signs. He would see children with Mickey Mouse ears posing in front of his castle, adults raising selfie sticks, couples recreating Instagram photos at the viewpoints. Would he feel avenged, seeing that his dream has conquered the world in a way his contemporaries never imagined? Or humiliated, sensing that his refuge has become a backdrop, that the rooms where he wanted to live out his most intimate fantasies are now fleeting screensavers, visible for a few seconds in a social media story before they vanish? We do not know what he would say, but we do know that a century and a half later, we keep entering his dream without having resolved our own contradictions. We are fascinated by the castle's beauty, but uncomfortable with the idea of a ruler who abandons the real world. We are drawn to the romantic image of the fairy tale king, but at the same time, we sense there is pain behind it, pressure, mental fragility, loneliness. We like to think of Neuschwanstein as a clean symbol of fantasy, but its history forces us to remember wars, expropriations, stolen art, propaganda, mass tourism, selective memory. And this is where you come in, you who have reached the end of this story. Do you think it is just a beautiful castle, or do you see something unsettling behind those perfect towers? If you ever visit it, will you prefer to keep only the postcard, the photo from Marienbrücke, or will you carry with you the layers of history, decisions, and silences hidden in every room? When you climb the stairs, when you look up at the ceiling in a room inspired by an opera, when you hear a guide explain in 10 minutes what we have taken hours to unravel here. Will you remember Ludwig walking alone through these half-empty corridors, the soldiers carrying crates of confiscated paintings, the modern restorer deciding which crack to repair and which to leave visible? The question goes beyond Neuschwanstein. How many other collective fantasies do we consume every day without asking what they hide? Fairy tale castles, yes, but also brands, platforms, political narratives, simplified versions of history. How many times do we accept the theme park version of something complex because it is easier, more comfortable, more suited to a quick photo and a pleasant memory? Europe, in looking at Neuschwanstein, looks at itself. It sees a continent capable of producing extreme beauty and extreme violence, artistic sensitivity and political brutality, refinement and denial. It sees its tendency to flee forward through architectural, ideological, or technological dreams, its skill at turning settings heavy with pain into bright travel posters. And we, in looking at Neuschwanstein, also look at ourselves. We see our need to escape, our attraction to the spectacular, our complicity with a way of consuming that often prefers the set to the truth. In the end, the story of this castle does not come down to a strange king, a spectacular building and a few million tourists. It speaks of debts, economic, emotional, historical, that pile up behind great dreams, of silences that settle into the walls, of decisions that seem private but end up affecting entire generations. Neuschwanstein is said to be the most photographed castle in Europe. But behind every tower there are unsettled accounts. Behind every gilded hall there are things left unsaid, and beneath every stone are reflected the fears of a continent still negotiating with its past. One man's dream became Europe's dark mirror, and every time we look at it, in a photo, in a film, in a logo, or perhaps one day from the Bavarian Valley with the castle etched against the sky, we are not just seeing a landscape, we are also seeing a part of ourselves.